We simply cannot allow people to pour into the United States undetected, undocumented, unchecked.
And complete the dang fence.
This bill that we will sign today is not a revolutionary bill.
Cast down your bucket where you are.
We come from France.
And I am, adamantly against illegal immigrants.
They're coming in by the thousands, just unbelievable.
The wall is an immorality.
Who are you rooting for?
Those masters of the universe are at it again.
You maniac! You blew it up!
Welcome to Parsing Immigration Policy, the podcast of the Center for Immigration Studies. My name is Mark Krikorian, Executive Director of the Center. And today we're going to be talking about sanctuary cities. Not just cities, but sanctuary counties, sanctuary states. The whole idea of so-called sanctuary, which is to say levels of government below the federal government that obstruct and interfere and actively do not participate in enforcement of the immigration laws. And this is something that's been around, obviously, for many, many years, decades even, to some degree. It really became a big deal, I think, when the George W. Bush administration initiative called Secure Communities was fully implemented. And what I mean by that is every jurisdiction in the United States now, when someone is arrested for any kind of crime, they're booked and fingerprinted. Everybody knows from police shows that those information, that all goes to the FBI. Well, starting in 2013, or it was completed in 2013, every jurisdiction in the country now, when you book somebody, that information goes not just to the FBI, but also to Homeland Security. So now ICE actually knows when pretty much every illegal alien, at least one that they have some record for, is arrested for drunk driving, for beating up his girlfriend, for selling drugs, what have you. And so now many people who are arrested by local jurisdictions are far more likely to come to the attention of immigration authorities, which is to say then the immigration authorities say, please hold on to this person. And in many jurisdictions, especially Democratic-dominated ones, they refuse to do so. So this has become a much more salient, much hotter, much more important issue over the past 10 years. There was a piece this week in the San Francisco Chronicle, which I would recommend to you. We'll put the link in the show notes, on Honduran illegal immigrant drug dealers in San Francisco. And apparently the drug business, selling drugs on the street in San Francisco, was dominated by Hondurans from a particular part of that country. It's a network phenomenon. I don't know, somebody got into the business and brought his brother and what have you. And it's very long. They went to Honduras. They talked to dozens of people in San Francisco and Honduras. And for me, one of the takeaways is how important San Francisco's status as a sanctuary city is to this network of drug dealers. I mean, the story even says, just one sentence, quote, San Francisco's status as a sanctuary city makes it more attractive to the Honduran dealers, some of them said, because it means a lower risk of lengthy jail time and deportation if convicted, unquote. So with that context, we have released a report this week by Jessica Vaughn, who's joining us, and her co-author Nathan DeSautis, who's an intern here, on the federal subsidies for sanctuary cities. And Jessica will explain this in more detail, but the Department of Justice has a number of law enforcement-related funding programs. It gives money for various purposes to local and state police. And a very large share of that money, and it's a big pot of money, goes to jurisdictions that are actively subverting the enforcement of the immigration laws by the federal government, the same federal government that's giving them money. And so Jessica actually quantified this, looked through the publicly available information. How much are we talking about here? And I thought it would be good to have her in to talk about it. The report's online at our website, cis.org. Again, the link will be in the show notes as well. But Jessica, thanks for joining us. And if you could tell us, first of all, what is the issue here and kind of what's the Cliff Notes version, and then we can get into a little more detail.
Sure. And that was a great summary of the whole sanctuary issue. And I just would add that when places like San Francisco and Chicago and a few other places originally started these sanctuary policies, this was at a very different time, probably in the 1980s, early 90s, when we were getting a lot of illegal migration from Central America. And their thought initially was to protect people who were coming here to work, economic migrants, from immigration enforcement. That was a lot more kind of random at the time. Whereas now, when the modern day, I guess, sanctuary movement started, as you pointed out, after the implementation of the Secure Communities program, it's really important for people to understand that the illegal aliens who are being protected here by these policies are the ones who've been arrested and flagged by ICE for removal.
Right.
So we're talking that small fraction of the illegal alien population that have been arrested for committing crimes in communities. So the sanctuary policies are really protecting criminal aliens, not asylum seekers or, the food truck guy down the street.
Well, there are some asylum seekers who are criminal aliens as well. But no, I think that's an excellent point, is that the way the pro-sanctuary people present this is as though local police are wandering the streets saying, hey, Paco, show me your green card, when in fact, all of this is people who've been arrested for local and state crimes, people who have been driving drunk, domestic violence, shootings, drug dealing, whatever it is. And then it actually turns out, hey, what do you know? This person's an illegal immigrant.
And the other justification often given for these sanctuary policies, of course, is that this myth that illegal aliens are less prone to commit crimes than others,
right,
and that they're not going to report crimes if the local police are turning people over to ICE, both of which are myths, as we've shown through our research,
right,
which our listeners can check out on our website. So sanctuary policies create all kinds of problems. The main problem is that they lead to the release of criminals who would otherwise be removed by ICE. And so that means they go back onto the streets to reoffend. And they're also actively obstructing a federal law enforcement agency in the pursuit of its legitimate authority and activity, which, by the way, most people support and want to see happen and is, in fact, mandated under our laws.
Although, frankly, whoever's running things in San Francisco probably don't believe that the enforcement of immigration law in general is even legitimate.
Right.
So,
well, that's why they do it. Because these are adopted for political reasons, because they disagree with immigration laws, not for any of the other trumped up reasons that we hear about. So what we've learned is that despite the fact that all these sanctuary jurisdictions, and we've identified 300 approximately in the United States.
We have a map of them, too, on our website.
On our website. And some of them are entire states, like California and Illinois and Rhode Island. And others are individual jurisdictions, sometimes within sanctuary states, but often in other states that take it upon themselves to adopt these obstructive policies. And one of the few tools available to the federal government to create a consequence for these policies that hinder ICE would be to deny sanctuaries access to federal funding. So I took a look at, with the help of our intern, Nathan DeSantos, took a look at how much money has been going to sanctuary jurisdictions. And the most recent year we found was 2021, that we could gather all the information on the three most important grant programs to law enforcement agencies from the Department of Justice.
And to be clear, this isn't FEMA funding or Department of Education funding. This is, because this is a law enforcement issue, you're looking just at these three law enforcement funding programs.
Right. Because the definition of a sanctuary jurisdiction that I've developed is one that has a deliberate policy in place to hinder cooperation between local law enforcement agencies and the feds, ICE primarily.
Right.
Either by denying detainers that ICE issues to take custody of someone, denying ICE access to the jails to interview inmates, or prohibiting its local officers from communicating with the feds about someone's immigration status, which, by the way, is something that is required under federal law. No jurisdictions are allowed to prevent officers from communicating with ICE. So what we found was that in 2021, the Department of Justice awarded about $300 million to sanctuary jurisdictions that were actively obstructing ICE from doing its job, which is a huge amount of money that is being provided to literally subsidize these law enforcement agencies that are in defiance of the laws that mandate their cooperation, and frankly, that are operating contrary to the public safety interests of their communities. It's a big chunk of money, and it's a chunk of money that should give the federal government some leverage in dealing with these local law enforcement agencies to incentivize cooperation. The feds can't force local law enforcement agencies to cooperate with them.
That's what I was going to ask, is because of our federal system, the states and cities don't work for Washington. And the Supreme Court has said that there's a concept of commandeering the policy, which is to say the federal government can't just turn off money for unrelated activity. In other words, they can't say, well, we're not giving you disaster funding because you are, say, a sanctuary cities, but these are specific to the issue. And so this is something that is permitted as a means of leverage against these jurisdictions.
Yes. And, the types of funding that we're talking about relate very closely to federal local cooperation, in some cases to community public safety, and specifically to the operation of immigration enforcement. The three programs that we looked at were, first of all, the SCAP program, which is the State Criminal Alien Assistance Program. And those are awards that were developed decades ago with the specific purpose of partially reimbursing corrections agencies, specifically jails and prisons, for the cost to them of incarcerating criminal aliens.
And the point there is the reason the criminal aliens are there is because the federal government failed, so the federal government should make them at least partly whole, if not whole.
Exactly. And yet, again, in 2021, there were $129 million given to sanctuary jurisdictions that are not doing anything about the illegal aliens that they're incarcerating and preventing the feds from getting these criminal aliens out of the country.
It takes a certain amount of chutzpah
Yeah.
to be a sanctuary city or state and say, we actually are actively obstructing enforcement of immigration law. Oh, and by the way, give us some money for the illegal aliens we have in our jails. It's ridiculous.
It is. It's completely hypocritical. It's illogical. They're taking the money in one hand and holding the other one up to, stiff arm ICE from getting to remove these aliens. And you could even argue that it's in their interest to have more illegal aliens in their jails because they get more money, but it does only return pennies on the dollar.
Right.
But still, the jails around the country rely on this money to help subsidize their operation. They can only use it for corrections salaries.
Mm-hmm.
So it's important to these jurisdictions. And I was really astounded to see that 58% of the SCAP money is going to sanctuaries.
Wow. So the majority of money to help jurisdictions cover some of the cost of imprisoning illegal immigrants is going to places that are obstructing the enforcement against illegal immigrants. It's unbelievable.
And not only that, this is the classic zero-sum game. There's a pot of money that Congress appropriates to give out. So all that money going to sanctuaries is money that is being denied to the majority of law enforcement agencies around the country that want to cooperate with ICE because they know the benefits
which
of
also do have some illegal immigrants in their jails.
Yes, lots of them.
Right.
Lots of them.
But how do you apply for this and who? Because presumably there's more people applying. Or is it everybody who applies gets money, but it's just divided up?
Well, there's a complicated formula that they use to determine the size of the grants that has to do with, first of all, how many illegal aliens, and they're verified illegal aliens for the most part in the jails. They also pay for what they call unknowns in the jails, which are people who couldn't be matched up with the DHS system, but are non-citizens and assumed to be illegal. So they pay a lesser amount for those. but it's also based on the corrections officers' salaries.
Oh, okay.
So,
Interesting. Yeah.
That's why a place like California is going to,
because his wages are high.
get kind of a disproportionate
But the point
share
is,
of it.
if sanctuary cities weren't getting this money, non-sanctuary jurisdictions, they're still bearing some costs.
Right. Imagine, Texas could get a lot more if California weren't taking so much. Same with Florida and other places.
Right.
So the other two grant programs we looked at are not as large as the SCAP program, but one is the Burn Justice Assistance Grants. And these are grants that Congress, I don't want to say it's pork, but there's a lot of discretion involved in these grants. So Congress gives a big pot of money to the states to then redistribute to law enforcement agencies in that state.
Mm-hmm.
And that's another $58 million going to sanctuaries, and more than half of that is going to sanctuaries. And then there's the community-oriented policing grants, which are actually, that is a larger sum than the SCAP money, but a lot of it goes to local police departments. But, still places like Chicago and Los Angeles and other counties there are getting huge, more than $1 million a piece for these grants to promote public safety activities and relationships between local cops and people in the community. And, again, that's money that could be going to cooperative jurisdictions that would, increase their trust in immigrant communities by removing the illegal alien criminals that the immigrants don't want to live with either.
Right, exactly. So what's the total amount again?
So it's about $300 million over the three grant programs. And the number one state getting federal money for law enforcement is California, unsurprisingly. But there are three notorious sanctuary cities that are getting very large grants. And I put the top 10 in the report, but the top three are Chicago, San Francisco, and Washington, D.C., where we're sitting right now, has a very strict sanctuary policy, and they're getting all this.
Frankly, Congress could prohibit anytime they want because Congress runs D.C. They just let the mayor and the city council, they kind of delegate authority to them, but Congress owns and runs the District of Columbia and can veto anything it does.
Yeah, that crossed my mind when I saw that, particularly because there have been some successful efforts by Congress and by a president to actually impose some penalties on sanctuaries, deny them access to this money, in a sense, defund the sanctuaries without running afoul of the law. And it started in 2015 when the then chair of the House subcommittee that controls the Department of Justice's budget.
Mm-hmm.
This happened after the Kate Steinle murder.
Right.
That case in San Francisco where an illegal alien who had been released by their sanctuary policy randomly murdered a young woman in San Francisco. He noted that every recipient of federal money has to attest that they are in compliance with all federal laws.
Right.
And there is a law on the books in two places that prohibits sanctuary policies, at least one form of them.
Right.
And so he said, look, if you're a sanctuary, you're violating federal law. You should not have access to this DOJ money. He got the Obama Attorney General, Loretta Lynch, of all people, to agree that that was the case and to write up the grant requirements to require every recipient of this funding to attest that they were not a sanctuary.
Right.
And then Trump came in and didn't need Congress to tell him to do that.
Right.
His Department of Justice started looking at sanctuary policies and preventing sanctuaries from getting this money. And I know of at least one big sanctuary jurisdiction at the time, Miami-Dade County, changed its policy because they did not want to lose access to this money. And jurisdictions all over the country were reviewing their sanctuary policies because that is a meaningful threat. And they did not want to lose this money. And as you point out, this is leverage that the federal government has and should be using to protect people. And again, it's not an abstract thing. Just recently in Fairfax County, Virginia, not far from where we're sitting, they're a sanctuary jurisdiction. There was a guy who was just arrested for trying to kidnap a young girl who had been arrested multiple times in Fairfax County that ICE was trying to take custody of to remove him. They refused. These are needless crimes, preventable crimes. And it's about time for Congress again to try to take action on this problem.
And now you said during the Trump administration, they tried to actually enforce some of these agreements. Were there lawsuits? What happened? Or was it just when Biden took over, they just stopped doing all of that? What happened?
Yes, there were lawsuits.
Right.
Among the many lawsuits against the Trump policies, one was brought by a number of the sanctuary cities in different places in the country. There was one in Chicago, there was one in Los Angeles, a few places around the country. They were working their way through the court system.
They were basically suing to keep the money.
Yes,
Okay.
To keep access to it. The city of Los Angeles was in fact denied some funding by Trump.
Right.
And, because it was a factor that they worked into the formula for awarding grants sometimes that, like they lost points for being a sanctuary.
Okay.
They couldn't really challenge that. But like the SCAP money and a few of these other programs, they did. Long story short, there were split decisions. They were trying to get it to the Supreme Court. By that time, Biden took office and immediately rescinded the Trump policy. And he has, by the way, implemented his own litmus tests for these grants. Now, instead of attesting to being in compliance with the federal law on sanctuaries, police departments and sheriff's departments have to give information about their diversity, equity, and inclusion hiring, about their de-escalation techniques, about, all manner of other politically charged things that have nothing to do with actual law enforcement, that they have to now meet the standards of the ideological standards of the Biden administration.
Tells you what's important to one administration and the next. I'm not even sure how this works. I'm not an attorney and I don't know how the wording is, but if they're attesting that they're complying with all federal law, and they're obviously not, in other words, they're acknowledging that they're not, isn't that perjury? In other words, at this point, it seems to me they give leverage beyond just turning the money off. It seems to me they've opened themselves up to criminal prosecution.
You would think so. And that's a very powerful incentive for these certifying officers in the various localities to make sure that they've got, all their T's crossed and their I's dotted.
Yeah.
And that was a real deterrent in places that I noticed.
Right.
That their certifying officers were hesitant to do that if they had these sanctuary policies in place, that they wanted that money.
Right.
But it takes the Department of Justice to actually enforce that.
Right.
Now, the Inspector General of the Justice Department did weigh in on this at a certain point at the end of the Obama administration and kind of tried to forestall some of the creative wording that's used around these sanctuary policies to clarify that certain provisions that are in a lot of these local ordinances were plainly, not inoculating them against being a sanctuary.
Mm-hmm.
So we have some pretty good standards by which to judge these policies that have been vetted by the OIG, and, it would be good for the courts to do that also. So I think all the pieces are in place for a much tougher policy on this for Congress. We're in the appropriation season now. This is something that congressional appropriators could work on immediately. And even states can do something about it too. There's a couple of states that have passed laws that prevent sanctuaries within them from getting some of these grants that are distributed by the states, like the Justice Assistance Grants and other state grant programs. Texas has done that.
Well, and states can prohibit sanctuary policies to begin with, because the localities are creations of the state legislature. It's not like the states and the federal government that are two separate sovereigns. The federal government doesn't create the state, but the state does create the city and the county, and so they can simply prohibit sanctuary policies, as, a number of states have done. I think Florida did, and a number of other states have,
there's about 8 or 9 of them that have passed good. Texas has the model legislation. They actually have criminal penalties on local law enforcement officers that don't follow the state law.
Interesting.
Requiring them to cooperate and to investigate immigration status.
Right.
So.
Interesting. So, the Biden administration is going to be around for at least another year and a half. How much leverage do Republicans in the House have? Obviously they have some because of appropriations, but are they that interested in it, in pursuing that? Because they have a lot of ducks to shoot at.
Well, they talk about it from time to time. It's something that's always on the table.
Mm-hmm.
They also look at clarifying federal law on ICE detainers and things like that. That would be helpful as well. But the appropriations have to happen every year.
Right.
You know, as long as there's not a continuing resolution, they would have the ability to dictate how these federal funds are awarded and make it clearer their intention as to who should have access to this money. And again, as you mentioned, we're not talking about cutting off Medicaid money or, FEMA emergency money. These are funds that are relevant to this issue of state and local and federal cooperation that impact public safety in American communities. And so it's a very urgent and legitimate thing for them to pursue right now.
And it seems like kind of a no-brainer, at least for the House Republicans. I mean, maybe the Senate, because the Democrats have a majority there, would fight against it, but they would have to decide, among many things, what are they willing to go to the mattresses on? And I don't know. I mean, it just seems to me that there should never be an appropriations bill coming out of the House, if the Republicans are there, that doesn't have restrictions on this sort of thing.
Right. And again, you can word it so that maybe you're not going after, going to affect all 300 of the sanctuaries that I've found, but the most egregious ones that are getting the most money, like Chicago and San Francisco. I mean, I think they're among the least likely to actually change their policy, but they might modify it. And at the very least, taxpayers won't be subsidizing this
They would at least
obstruction.
lose the money, and it would go to help jurisdictions that aren't obstructing.
Right. And I think a lot of them on the margins would change their policies from what we've already seen during that period when this was being regulated more. They will change their mind. They want this money.
Right. Especially, like you said, the ones that are kind of where it's not as salient a political issue. They're not as wedded to it.
Right.
Like
It's not
San
part of their
Francisco
identity
is.
like
Yeah,
San
exactly,
Francisco.
Like San Francisco, exactly, where they really want to have Honduran illegal alien drug dealers wandering the street. Okay, good. Thank you, Jessica. The report's on our website, still subsidizing sanctuaries, and we'll see if anybody maybe in the, House of Representatives is interested in this information. It's all public. In other words, we didn't have to sue anybody to get this. It's all out there. You just put it together into one place and put it into context. We'll see if there's any action on this sanctuary issue and maybe have you back to talk about it or any number of other things in the future.
Thank you. We can hope and dream.
Yeah, exactly. And finally today, I wanted to talk about something the Biden administration announced recently, and it's called Family Reunification Parole Program, which they extended to 4 countries, Colombia, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, expanding something the Obama administration had started for Cuba and Haiti. And what it means is that people from those countries who are still in those countries who have relatives in the United States who filed a green card application for them under one of the categories for family immigration, which are numerically limited. Those people have to wait until a visa becomes available because they are numerically limited. For instance, just as one example, the category for the adult brothers and sisters of adult U.S. citizens is capped at $65,000 a year. So if there's more demand for that, and there always is, than there are available visas, you have to wait in line. And so what this program that the Biden administration has expanded does is that if you have a relative who filed an application for you and you don't have a number that's come up yet, you get to just move to the United States anyway. And they parole you in and you get a work permit and you basically wait here. I mean, you're working and living here until your green card number comes up. Then they'll give you a green card. But you're already here. You're already living here legally, already working. And the reason this is a problem is because it literally turns immigration law on its head. The way the Immigration and Nationality Act is constructed is that Congress has given the president total authority to keep anyone out of the country, but he's only allowed to let people in the country under very limited circumstances. Now, the number of people that Congress has authorized him to let in is still too high, and it's also too complicated, and that all those problems are real and we at the center talk and write about them all the time. But nonetheless, the principle is president gets to keep out anyone he wants, but he can only let in people to move and live here under very limited, circumscribed rules. What this parole program represents, and frankly, what all of the various other parole programs represent, is a basic inversion of the immigration law. This administration, and really people in general, both on the left and on the libertarian right, those in effect who oppose immigration limits, how the way they conceive of their authority is that the president actually gets to let in anyone he wants in any number for any reason he feels like, and he can only keep people out under very limited circumstances, as we saw under President Trump when he tried to actually keep people out of the country, was beset with lawsuits and clearly showed the reimagined Immigration and Nationality Act on the part of the left in allowing the executive to let in anybody he wants, but very limited in whom he can keep out. And this is a pretty fundamental, I would say even revolutionary approach to the immigration law. Now, if Congress wanted to pass legislation that reflected that, I would think that would be a bad idea, but Congress has the authority to do that. That's not what Congress has done. Congress has said in the law very explicitly, president can keep out anybody he wants, but can only let in people that we have said he's allowed to let in. And this administration is trying to basically flip immigration law on its head. And it's long past time for Congress, frankly, just for purposes of institutional protection, or in other words, defending its prerogatives, to push back. And if, say, Democrats in Congress like current immigration law or want it to be even more expansive, well, they can make a case for that. But Congress as an institution needs to take back the power to decide who gets to come into the country, because if we continue with this approach of presidents just being able to let in anybody they feel like with parole and then give them work permits, then it's the president who's deciding how many people get to move to the United States and live here, not Congress. And Congress's role is basically just relegated to deciding what color photo ID card you get to have, because the work permit, the employment authorization document, which DHS gives people who don't have green cards but are allowed to work, is kind of pinkish. And the green card, actually, believe it or not, is kind of greenish. But that's not the way the law is supposed to work. Congress's role isn't just deciding what color ID card you have. Congress's role is to decide who gets to live in the United States and who doesn't. And this administration is challenging that fundamentally. This latest parole program is just a reminder of that broader push. And the Biden administration's pursuit of unlimited immigration, which is what this is, has to be stopped by Congress, regardless of what members of Congress think immigration law should be. They're the ones who should be deciding it. That's it for this episode of Parsing Immigration Policy. This is Mark Krikorian, Executive Director of the Center for Immigration Studies. If you liked the show, or even if you didn't, rate and review us if your platform allows that. And feel free to email us at center@cis.org if you have comments, complaints, whatever it is that's on your mind about the issue. And I hope you'll tune in next week.